And you can ask questions in the chat feature. If you want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature as well. So we're going to move right into our next topic. And we talked about pasture management. Now let's talk about for livestock. Now let's talk about how drought impacts our wildlife. We have a lot of folks that are getting income from wildlife management, and so you know how that affects us as well. So here to speak on that topic, we have Dr. Maureen Frank. She's our extension wildlife specialist, and I believe this is right outside her back door, maybe. That photo she has. So she's down in Uvalde, the beautiful area of Texas. So take it away, Maureen.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, this could just about be out my back door. Unlike y'all over in East Texas, we've been a little drier out here, although thankfully we've had some good rains lately. So today I'm going to be talking about insulating your wildlife, how you prepare and manage for drought. I hope that you'll notice some themes that are similar into what Dr. Corrier Olson was talking about and what Dr. Clayton will be talking about. I think you'll see some things that are similar. It's just that here the focus is on managing for wildlife. This is a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this talk. We're going to talk a lot about habitat. That's my favorite thing to talk about. And then we're going to talk about two other really important concepts, resilience and insulation, and how those relate to your wildlife management. All right, so the three most important things when we are managing wildlife. We always like to make our brigades kids guess at this when I teach South Texas buckskin brigades most years. But I'll go ahead and give them to you here. Habitat, habitat, and habitat. So it's kind of like when we're talking about real estate and they say location, location, location is what matters. Habitat is essential when we're talking about wildlife management. And you may have heard that before, but I really want to break down today what habitat is and how your habitat can be as good as possible when you're going into a drought. So I chose this picture here because a lot of people would look at that picture, and if I asked you, how does that look like good habitat to you? This is the Kerr Wildlife Management Area. It's managed for a variety of wildlife species. Does that look like good habitat? A lot of people would say, yes, that looks like great habitat. Looks like it's not a drought. Looks pretty good to me. And I would reply, that is terrible habitat for alligators. And I say this jokingly, but because the point is that habitat is species specific. And so when we just look at a landscape and say, what kind of wildlife habitat is this? We can't manage for all different species of wildlife at once. Obviously, you want to start by managing for what species you have in the area. You're not managing for alligators in Kerr Wildlife Management Area. That was never their goal. But even if you have deer on your place and quail and turkeys, those three animals can certainly all occur together on a place, but they have slightly different needs. And those are definitely three species that have different levels of adaptation to dealing with drought. So that's really important to consider is which species do you have and how do you meet their habitat needs, those specific needs on your property. So it's important that we break down habitat into its four different components, and those are food, water, shelter, and space. So because we're talking about drought today, I'm mainly going to focus on that water component, but I'm not just going to talk about water for water's sake. I'm also going to talk about how water can be food, how water can be shelter, how water can be space, and how all of those three components can be affected during a drought. First off, it's important that we recognize there are three different types of water. First is free water, and that's what we typically think of. That's what's in streams and ponds and rain and your water bottles. That's what we normally think of as water, and it's important for drinking, right? So that I've referred to here as physiological needs, what your body needs to survive, what the body of an animal needs to survive. Also for bathing, that's important, more important for some of our species than others. And thermoregulation, this is why we usually see wild pigs, which are an exotic species, in relation with water availability, is because they can't cool off very well, and so they use the water to maintain their body temperature at a certain point. Now, one of our other types of water is preformed water, and this refers to water that is contained in food. So that bottom picture there, that hawk is eating a nice juicy insect of some kind. I can't tell if it's a grasshopper or a caterpillar, but it's nice and green and plump. That means it has probably really high water content as opposed to eating something that's, a little bit drier. When we talk about songbirds that are eating seeds, for example, seeds are, basically little dried out packets that carry the plant on into the next year, but there's not a lot of water available. Our last type of water is metabolic water, and that's simply what's produced when you break down a molecule of carbohydrate or protein or fat. You get energy, which is the goal, and carbon dioxide, which is waste, but then another byproduct of that is water. A lot of our native wildlife are adapted to using that preformed water very efficiently, and that metabolic water as well. This is why we'll say that quail, bobwhite quail, can go their entire lives without drinking water. They don't need that free water if they're getting enough preformed water. So you may be thinking, Dr. Frank, I've seen bobwhite quail drink water. I know they come into water sources, and they will, because sometimes that's a good supplemental source for them, or because they're not getting enough preformed water. But if conditions are right, they can get by without it. That's one of their adaptations. How can water be related to food? Well, for one, a lot of plants grow in and around the water, right? So this is, if you have any source of water on your property, I'm sure you know that that's a great place to find wildlife. A lot of our different animals, or a lot of our different food for animals, in addition to plants, a lot of the smaller animals live in and around the water. Again, that's something else that draws other species to come to the water to hunt. But what's really important, whether you have standing water on your property or not, is that water makes plants grow, right? So regardless of what type of wildlife you're managing for, they are going to be using plants to make a living to some degree, whether it's because they're eating them because you have an herbivore, or because they're using them as shelter or space. And so when you don't have enough rain, you're not going to have those plants to provide those other resources. So speaking about water as shelter, again, we have some wildlife that need to be in the water itself for themselves as shelter, to keep their young safe as they're raising babies. Riparian habitats, again, maybe not, the animals aren't necessarily in the water, but when there's a tree growing along a stream, those trees tend to be bigger, and when they fall over, they make nice big logs, and taller vegetation. All of those things can be used as shelter. But again, even if you don't have standing water on your property, using that vegetation as shelter can be very important for our wildlife. The best example here, and this ties into what Dr. Corrier-Olsen was saying about not overgrazing, and this is especially true on rangelands here, is that you want to leave not just enough grass, but enough tall grass to be shelter for your wildlife. That's really crucial for a few of our species that I'll talk about here in a minute. And then finally, water is space. When we talk about habitat, we often focus on the food, water, and shelter components because we can see those. And space is a little bit more nebulous, but when we talk about space, we're not just talking about wide open spaces, because I'm sure y'all have plenty of those, but we're talking about the arrangement and connectivity of those other components of habitat. Do you have enough food, water, and shelter on your property? Are they arranged in a way that distributes them across the property? And are they well connected? And there's a reason that I went ahead and put a picture of a toad on this slide, and that's because, again, you need to think about which species you're interested in managing for, and where on your property you're going to be seeing most of those species. If we're talking about something like managing doves, I gave a program last week on dove management. They'll fly a good little distance to find water. They prefer to stay within about 4 miles, but 5 to 10 miles, not a huge deal. Again, they fly, they have wings, not too hard to get from one spot to the other. Bobwhite quail, on the other hand, they can sort of fly. They also have wings, but they're just not going as far, right? So if you have, again, water's not as much of a concern for them, but shelter, if your what we call quail houses, your brush that is a good shape and size to hide a quail from a predator, if those are too far apart, it's going to be too far of a distance for your quail to fly. And that if they're not well connected, then that puts your quail at greater risk of predation. Again, I specifically chose a toad for this slide because it is kind of the ultimate example of needing that connectivity and how it can be affected by drought. When it rains, toads come out because that water is basically connecting them to other areas of water that wouldn't normally be connected because they cannot cross wide, dry areas. They've got to hop one little hop at a time, and they can't go very far, very fast. Now, water as space is very dynamic again. So I mentioned toads coming out during the rain, floods, drought, erosion, human use and development. All of those different things affect how water is going to appear on the landscape, what the shape of that water is, and how well our different resources are going to be connected for our wildlife. Another really important concept when we're talking about habitat is limiting factors. And so if you're thinking about a species, so for example, these are quail eggs in this picture. They're actually Gamble's quail eggs, but we're thinking about quail. And we know that we need to think about habitat, and there's all these different components. Well, kind of like Dr. Corrier-Olsen was just talking about and getting a soil sample, if what's limiting you is potassium, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put on your soil, you're not going to get that growth that you need because potassium is what's limiting you. It's very, very true in the same way with habitat. A lot of times in a drought, we're thinking about that water component, right? And we think, well, there's not enough water. Maybe, we think about there's kind of a saying, if it rains, we have quail, and if it don't, we won't. And so we think about water as being what's limiting those quail from having more. We think, well, if we had more water, we'd have more quail. But it's not always the water per se. Usually, in most places that I've seen, what's limiting our quail populations is the availability of good nesting habitat. This is because, as I'm sure you all know, quail are very vulnerable to predators. They're, some people call them nature's snacks, or they say quail are waiting for a place to die. Lots of things like to eat quail. Well, even more than things like to eat adult quail, things like to eat eggs, right? Eggs are, basically a snack that can't get away from you. So that's pretty tempting for a lot of predators. And quail, because they're ground nesting birds, they're going to look for a bunch grass that they can put these eggs in. Well, if all of your grass is grazed down so low that you don't have any tall bunch grasses, you don't have any nesting habitat. And it doesn't matter how much it rains, if you're overgrazing that too short, you're not going to have nesting habitat, and that shelter is what's limiting you from having better quail populations. So again, it's just important to think about, for different species, what is your factor that's limiting you. All right, so the concept of resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And so when we think about drought, that's obviously one of our difficulties. And I appreciate everyone who's attending today, even though we've had some rain recently, and so it might be easy to think, oh, I don't need to think about this quite yet, but you have more ability to recover from difficulties if you plan for them in advance. And there's kind of two different types of difficulties that we can see that are going to affect our landscape. So there's shocks and stress, and both of these kind of hit a system in a different way. Something like a flood is a shock. And I say here, sort of kind of unpredictable, right? So we don't know, unlike our really handy drought monitor, we don't have a when is a flood going to occur. Now we do get flash flood warnings, right? On your phone, it might go off, or, you're paying attention to the National Weather Service. So you're not totally caught off guard, but you're certainly not planning for it weeks in advance. And any sort of shock is something that happens suddenly and ends quickly. Another example of this would be a wildfire, and not a planned fire, but an out of control wildfire. You didn't know it was going to happen. You might have known it could happen because it was during a drought, high wind, etc. But it happens, it goes through, and then it's done. Of course, the impacts are not done, but the actual event is short-lived. Drought, on the other hand, is a stress. Benefit of some of our stresses is that they're sort of kind of predictable. So again, we have that really handy drought monitor chart. Does it tell us for sure what's going to happen? No, but it gives us a little bit of a heads up to where you can say, hey, we might not be in a drought now, but there's a good chance one is coming, so let's get ready while we can. Downside of the stress is that they're usually long lasting, right? So that can go on for months and months or even years and years. In either case, the more prepared you are on the front end, the better able you will be to weather that storm. So how do we prepare? Let's talk about insulation. This is a scaled quail. For those of y'all that are in East Texas, might not be as familiar with this species. They're especially drought resistant and adapted for these drier climates. As you can see, this one's hanging out here on a cactus. And I chose him because he was a little bit puffed up. He looks like he's insulated for whatever is up ahead. But I like this quote because no matter what happens and no matter what your landscape looks like right now, you can make changes that will prepare you to put your wildlife in a better spot for whatever is to come. So when we're talking about insulation, I kind of borrowed this concept from Dr. Dale Rollins, who is our bobwhite quail expert of the rolling plains. And the idea is that when we know that drought is going to be coming, we want to insulate or protect our wildlife from that as much as possible. We want to give them a buffer. So if we think of our wildlife as the ice, we want to keep them from melting as long as possible. If your property is completely overgrazed, like some of those pictures that Vanessa had, that's kind of like that first picture here. Oh, I forgot I made my cursor extra big so I could show you all this. So that's kind of like this first picture where we just throw our ice on the ground and hope for the best. And that which falls in the shade of the grass will last a little bit longer, and most of it's going to melt pretty quick. Then, of course, next picture here, we've got kind of an old-fashioned cooler, right? This is what coolers looked like when I was growing up. Even if you were somewhere that was relatively cool, your ice might only last 1 or 2 days. And for sure, if you were somewhere hot, you'd be lucky, kind of to make it through the end of the day. That's probably where a lot of properties are as far as wildlife habitat. You're not just quite throwing your ice on the ground, but it's not going to last very long if a drought hits. If you have that really hot day, that ice won't last quite as long. What you want to be, the goal for all of us should be this cooler on the bottom. Again, I'll say that these are just pictures that I grabbed from Creative Commons sources. I am not necessarily advocating for any of these brands, but the bottom cooler is meant to represent what we call a molded cooler, which can hold ice sometimes for really way longer than necessary, depending on the length of your trip. But we want our landscape to be like that. We want our habitat for wildlife to be ready for however long the drought is going to last. And maybe we're a little over prepared, but we'd rather be over prepared than under prepared. So Aldo Leopold is known to be the kind of the father of wildlife management, and this quote here is one that I use a lot in my talks because it talks about the practical ways that we're going to put this management into practice. But I think it also talks a little bit about resilience because these tools that are listed out here were used in the past to destroy, here it refers to game, but that can really refer to any different types of wildlife. And they can also be used to restore those populations. So just because something's been done wrong in your property in the past doesn't mean that you can't change it. So I want to go through each of these tools briefly and talk about how you can use them specifically to make your property insulated for drought. But first, I stole this a little bit from Dr. Clayton, and she may have something similar in her presentation. Before we talk about any tools, we have to talk about goals. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but because habitat is species specific, you need to know which species do you have and which species do you want to manage for. And even more specifically, why do you want to do those things? Do you want as many white-tailed deer as possible so that you can have as many hunting opportunities as possible? Or do you want to grow really big bucks? That's a little bit different. Or are you maybe, I know in East Texas, a lot of quail populations are not doing so well, but maybe you have some quail and you hope to keep them there. Whatever those look like, write them down. Make them as specific as possible. Again, at very least, make them species specific. But even beyond that, why do you want to see that specific species? What do you hope to get out of your interactions with those species? And then make them adaptable. The goals will change a little bit, and your what you desire to use your land for might change a little bit, and also just to adapt to things like different weather conditions. Learning your land and understanding what you have in the first place is going to be important, and then continuing to write down what you do and what happened, right? So I disked this pasture on this date and it did not work. And then why didn't it work? Maybe because you had a drought and you learned that that wasn't a great idea. Or when I disked in this area, it actually increased the invasive plants. Let's not do that again. But when I disked in this other area, or maybe when I burned in this other area, we had a good result. A lot of natives came back. So let's do that again, and let's do that at that same time of year. This also helps if you have a biologist or other consultant come out. It helps them see what you've done and some of the patterns on your land. So looking at that first tool, the axe, I'm gonna let Dr. Clayton talk about this some more. This may be in her presentation, but following brush control recommendations sometimes means not using the axe because you need brush to be healthy if you're going to use something like an herbicide so that it takes that herbicide up properly. Another place that you can use the axe, though, for example, is that if it's during a drought and you don't have great brush and you know that one of the things that your quail are lacking is shelter from predators, you can use a technique called half cutting. What you do to half cut is, so for example, these mesquite here on this picture, we'd choose some of these branches and we would only cut halfway through the branch. And what that will do is it will cause those branches to droop down and kind of make a skirt around the tree so that quail can get in at the bottom. Now, the mesquite in this picture has some cover on the bottom, but as you can see, especially because it's dry in this picture, there's not a lot of vegetation down here. So a terrestrial predator, something down on the ground, would be able to see under there pretty well, even if a quail was hiding. So by half cutting, we give them some of that shelter from some visual screening from predators. Another time to restrain from using the axe is when you do unfortunately have those trees that die during a very serious drought. Now, if they're close to a house or some other structure, of course, cut them down because it's important to protect life and property. But if they're out in the middle of wherever, just leave them standing because that's very valuable nesting habitat for our cavity-dwelling birds, such as woodpeckers, bluebirds. It's very common to put up eastern bluebird boxes or boxes for swallows, purple martins. All of those are cavity nesting birds that before we were around to put up boxes for them, they nested in natural cavities. For the most part, those snags are something that we have fewer of on the landscape, and so you can leave those alone. That can really benefit those native songbirds, and that counts as a management action if you have a wildlife tax valuation. Grazing conservatively, like Vanessa talked about, thinking about your goals. If your goal is continuing to maintain cattle, realize that your wildlife may suffer a little bit because of that if you're grazing too heavily. If you have wildlife, especially during a drought, you want to pull off as many animals as you can. Again, leaving as much of that grass. You may not have wildlife that's eating grass, but they're using it as shelter. I talked about quail and using bunch grasses for nesting, but tall grasses are also really important for deer to hide their fawns in. We think about brush as being the, where all the big bucks hide. And that's true. The bucks like to hide in brush, but newborn baby fawn, that's not where mama's going to leave it. She wants to find some tall grass to leave it. So especially if you're having problems with fawn survival, make sure your grazing is as low as possible, especially during a drought, so that you have that grass for your fawns. If your goals are to, manage for both cattle and wildlife, you're kind of trying to optimize both of those things, there's going to be some trade-offs there. And you might want to think about, especially during certain times of year, if there's a pasture where you typically see quail, don't graze in that pasture. And it might even be better to kind of overgraze one of your other areas until you know that those chicks are hatched out and kind of up and going and on their way. Food plots are what I want to address when we talk about the tool that is the plow. Food plots are a catch-22 because when you need them, you can't grow them. And when you can grow them, you usually don't need them. And what I mean by that is that during drought is usually when it's like, hey, a food plot would be great to provide supplemental forage for deer, is usually what we're talking about. Usually the species we're talking about. But if we're not having enough rain to grow our native vegetation, we probably aren't going to have enough rain to grow our food plot either. So I don't often like to recommend food plots just because there is that uncertainty of what will happen if we get a drought. However, you can use quote unquote plow, so here a disc implement, to reset the native vegetation to an earlier succession. And what I mean by that is that in areas where we have grass, we want to reset that to forbs or weeds. Those are kind of our earlier stage. And what forbs provide for our wildlife is, for one, they provide food for deer. Deer do not rely on grass to eat. Forbs are the most nutritious thing for them. And they also provide food for our quail. They do that in 2 ways, well, really 3 ways. Quail will eat the leaves directly. They'll eat the seeds, and that's valuable because those seeds are going to be there later in the year when other sources of food are running out. And the other thing that's really important is insects. And now I know Dr. Corrier Olson talked about, you not wanting your insects when you're in improved pasture, and I understand that. But if we're talking about wildlife management, insects are fantastic, especially for quail. Dr. Rollins refers to them as a meal ready to eat because they're high in fat, high in protein, and high in water content. So especially during a drought, those insects are so valuable, really to all of your birds, but quail included in that. And we find higher densities of those insects on our native plants. So our field full of forbs should also have a lot of insects that are going to benefit our quail. Again, this goes back to knowing your goals and what species are you trying to manage when you're thinking about doing something like disking. Also, knowing your land. It's important to know your plants and know what species you have out there and know whether you might have invasive species that could take advantage of a disturbance and start to take over if you disc. And so there's some time of year consideration to put into this. But the nice thing about simply disking as opposed to trying to grow a food plot is that you're not buying seed. It's less expensive. You're not putting that much investment into it. You're just disturbing the land, disturbing the soil so that you can get that nice regrowth. I also put here work with, not against nature. That's because a lot of times we'll have a certain area in our property that's a little more suited for this than others. So when you're deciding where is it that I should disc, or if you are going to do a food plot, where should I do this? Don't put it where you think it's going to be most convenient. Put it where it's going to be most successful based on the way the landscape is laid out. Maybe a little bit low-lying area so that it is going to catch that moisture and be more successful. All right, burning strategically as well. This is kind of like, managing your brush strategically may not be the best idea during a drought, depending on what species you have and if you have invasives that may take advantage of this. During a burn ban, again, this can be something tricky. You have to get this approved by your county judge before you're able to burn, and there's a lot of liability that goes into there can be a lot of liability that goes into burning as well. It's very good to work with a prescribed burn association, and I recommend that you do that. But it can be useful during a drought. Fire is something that is natural to the landscape, and it can be another way to reset succession and get some really good regrowth of plants, especially when those rains do come. Depending on how long it has been since there's been fire on your property, it may take a while before you start to see those differences in wildlife. I'm conducting a study in the hill country right now on some places that we're kind of comparing burned and unburned pastures on the same property and how the bird species look on those areas. And because it had been a while since they had burned and there's just been one burn done so far, we actually haven't seen that much difference. And so they really need to conduct another burn before we're going to start to see some difference there. All right, and then our last tool is the gun. And so it's really important to remember to hunt for the long term. When we're in drought conditions, it can be really hard to decide what to do when it comes to hunting, whether that means that whether you're the one who owns the property and has a lease, or whether you are leasing a hunt on someone else's property. The most important thing I would say for hunting is to make sure you are taking a census every year. I put that in quotes here because unlike the US Census that we're all doing this year, it's not a true, whenever we're studying wildlife, it's not a true count because census refers to counting every single one. But what you're looking for, so for example, white-tailed deer, going out and doing a deer census using recommended techniques means that in August, September, you'll go out and conduct spotlight counts, if that's the method that you're using, or you may have game cameras set up. But you want to look for those trends. You want to see, do I have about the same number as last year? How is my buck to doe ratio? How is my doe to fawn ratio? How does fawn survival look? And how does that compare to the previous year? You may have fewer deer than your neighbor, but yours have been increasing while theirs have been decreasing or remaining steady. So it's not necessarily that exact number, but it's those ratios and those trends that you want to look for. Using those recommended techniques, I put that here because that's especially important during a drought. Because, for example, when you're setting up something like a spotlight survey, the route that you choose to follow needs to go through a variety of habitats, and it needs to avoid anything that might artificially concentrate deer. So you don't want to drive by a feeder or a water source when you're counting for deer, because especially during a drought, you're really going to concentrate animals in those areas. And it might look like, actually our deer are doing pretty well right now, when in fact you're just seeing more than you normally would because more of them need to come to that water source than they normally would. Sometimes for hunting, especially if you have quail, you may need to take a year off, or you may need to modify a little bit. Maybe you decide not to harvest any bucks that year because you have, you're not seeing a whole lot, and your buck to doe ratios are skewed. So maybe you choose to just harvest does. Maybe your numbers are down overall, and so you say, we probably shouldn't harvest anything. Harvesting exotics, on the other hand, is always a good idea, especially during a drought. Unfortunately, what we're seeing with some of our exotic species is that they are able to switch to types of food that our native white-tailed deer cannot take advantage of. So depending on where you are, again, in the hill country, we're usually talking about axis, they can take advantage of eating grass. So when all the forbs and browse are gone and the white-tailed deer are starting to go hungry, they can switch to grass and do just fine, which is why in some places we have more axis deer now than we do white-tailed deer, and that's becoming quite a problem. Pigs, absolutely, you should always be harvesting because they're only having negative impacts on your landscape. All right, so I have just one slide on this, but I want to talk a little bit about, changing that limiting factor. If water is your limiting factor, what can you do to provide water for wildlife? One option that can be really fantastic is to build what we call a guzzler or a wildlife waterer, and go ahead and build it now. You don't want to wait for a drought for this to happen, but what this is a structure that's going to capture rainwater. So you can see this here, there's a corrugated metal on top, and then this one's a demonstration. So they've poured water on top of it, but the rain would fall, run off of this roof and into this trough, and then it's being collected into a barrel, into a storage tank, so that later when there's not rain for a while, wildlife can still have a place to come get a drink. These are very popular in West Texas, but they can work just fine anywhere. You want to design them for wildlife. A game camera can be very helpful to monitor their use. If you want to see something interesting out in Fort Davis, I think it's the Borderlands Research Institute, has a tank with a game camera on it, and they get just some fascinating wildlife that comes into it. But that's a really good way to provide water. You want it to come out at ground level so that it's easy for a variety of species to access. And we do have a publication through AgriLife that's all about how to build a guzzler, what it can look like for different species. And again, that's something that you want to do now while we have rain so that you can start to store up that rain for later. A pond is another good example. Again, you may already have stock tanks or ponds on your place. It's not something that I necessarily recommend if you're just managing for wildlife because of A, the maintenance that's required to keep it up, and B, when you have a large surface area of water, evaporation is a concern. So the nice thing about those wildlife guzzlers is that that tank where that water is being stored is going to save that water up, and then the opening the wildlife will drink from is smaller so that you aren't just losing that water to evaporation when we have hot, dry days. Finally, it's possible to modify an existing tank. So you may not have a pond on your place, or you might not quite be up for building a guzzler, but you can do things like, allowing a little bit of overflow from a trough can be very valuable, especially because you'll get some nice green vegetation growing around that. I've had some people say, well, that's not a good idea because the hogs are going to, cause problems. They're going to wallow around it. They already maybe get in the trough. Putting rocks in the trough can be really useful because that gives wildlife such as songbirds a perch so that they can choose where they want to be in that water level and access that a little bit better. And if you do have something, for example, a mouse that gets in, it has basically kind of a ramp to get out. And it's important to remember that a lot of pretty much all wildlife prefer running water. So we have some landowners in West Texas that have added solar pumps to their livestock tanks with some rocks so that you get that little bit of drip of water. And they do that for bird ecotourism because birds are very attracted to that dripping water. And so then it's a good place that you can see species. This picture on the bottom right here, we're peeking over the fence at the bird blind at Kickapoo Cavern State Park. And this is just, it can range in how this looks. This is very natural. You almost couldn't tell that it's here, but there's a water source back here, a little bit of running water that goes over these rocks and into a small pond there. It can look like this, and that's awesome, or it can be a concrete tank with a solar pump, and that's good too. All right, so in summary, it's important to manage for healthy habitat in all conditions, no matter whether it's a drought right now or whether you've got plenty of rain. If you manage for that healthy habitat, it'll give some insulation for your wildlife for when drought hits, because it's a when, not an if scenario. Finally, I mentioned some resources here, including that how to build a wildlife guzzler. All of those are available at the AgriLife bookstore. You can just type a search term in and it will bring up different resources for you. It's agrlifebookstore.tamu.edu. We also have some of those publications on our website, which is wildlife.tamu.edu, and there's a lot of them as well on TextNat, which is listed there as well. I mentioned a little bit about knowing your land and knowing which plants are going to grow in certain places. This is helpful when planning food plots or where to disc as well. Web Soil Survey is a really fantastic free online tool that will show you which soils you have underlying your property and can help you understand which places are most likely to grow which types of plants. And then finally, if you don't already know your local biologist, I highly encourage you to meet with him or her. There is a Parks and Wildlife page called Find My Biologist, and I think if you type that into your search bar on your browser, you can find that. But that will allow you to find your local county biologist, and they can come out and do site visits on your property and help you understand specifically. Again, I kept this kind of broad because there's a lot of different species that you might be managing for, but that person can give you specific recommendations as to what might be good on your land. Finally, that's my email address. If there's any questions that you have after, I think it's about time to roll right into Dr. Clayton. But if there's any resources that you can't find or any questions that you have, feel free to send me an email and I'll try to help out with that.